Hello, everybody. I don't know if you can hear me. If you want to let me know in the chat box if you can hear me, that would be great. This is Christy. Thanks. All right, awesome. Well, I'm going to go ahead and mute myself and give it a few more minutes for the other attendees to show up. I know usually our afternoon webinars are a little less heavily attended than our morning webinars, but I'm still hoping we'll have a good number of people come. So I'm going to mute myself and give it a little bit. Stay where you are. We'll be back in a few minutes. For those of you just joining, give us just a few minutes so we can wait on everybody to get here. Our webinar is scheduled to start at 3 o'clock, which is still in a couple of minutes. We'll probably be starting then. And those of you just joining, we're going to get started in just a couple of minutes. If you want, you can feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box. You can feel free to include your name, your pronouns, and if you want to say what agency you're with, you're welcome to, so we kind of know who all we have on the line. All right. So I may go ahead and get us started with the webinar. If you want, there is a feature just kind of orienting you to some of the tech here. There is a feature where you can raise your hand and I can call on you. You can also type questions or thoughts you have in the chat box, but I see that I have a feature where I can allow you to talk, where I can unmute one of you if you do have a question that you wanted to ask. So feel free to do that during the webinar to ask any questions that you have. Raise your hand if you have a question or an idea, and I will see if I'm able to unmute you. I've never done that during the webinar, so hopefully that'll work, because I really do like having engagement and hearing some of your ideas. So a little bit about NCCASA, because I know this webinar is open to NCCASA member agencies, but also to Child Advocacy Center of North Carolina CAC staff and MDT members. So NCCASA is an inclusive statewide alliance working to end sexual violence through education, advocacy, and legislation. Our framework is a social justice framework, so we believe in doing our work from a strong intersectional social justice perspective. By centering our work around marginalized communities, we believe that everybody gets served. Sometimes we forget to pay attention to who's not showing up at our doors or using our services, or how we can make them more sensitized and welcoming and inclusive. So we try to keep focused on that. Our work is to organize and sponsor statewide trainings around sexual violence. We provide training and technical assistance to rape crisis programs and resource sharing. Technical assistance, for those of you who aren't familiar with the term, is sort of a hybrid between customer service and life coaching, just like many of your agencies are the hotlines for survivors in your area, where they can call and talk through their options and get access to resources and information. Our agency is sort of the hotline for your agencies and for your staff. We do legislative work and policy change at the local and national level. We do a lot of anti-human trafficking work and outreach. We provide prevention education, so that is my job. We have a pretty strong program helping people learn about violence prevention and how to implement those programs in their area. And we do a lot of campus-based work on colleges and university campuses. A little bit about language. A lot of times you'll hear people say she as the victim and he as the harm doer, but we're aware that that's not always how it happens, even though research shows us that 90% of sexual assault victims are women and the majority of perpetrators are men. We are aware that there could be built-in bias in the way we're framing and looking at and researching and gathering those statistics. We also use a lot of non-gendered pronouns in our trainings, like they, them, to acknowledge that victims and harm doers can be of any gender, even a non-binary gender. So not all women are victims, not all men are perpetrators. Any gender can be a victim, and any gender can be a harm doer or perpetrator. This webinar is LGBTQ 101, Basic Knowledge and Terminology. This webinar came about. We've done a lot of work around this less formally, and this webinar came about because Child Advocacy Center of North Carolina's victim advocates were having their weekly meeting during COVID a few weeks ago. And this is a topic that they brought up that they would like to get more training on, and someone recommended me and they reached out. So I put this training together originally to give it as a webinar on their victim advocate meeting last week. But we also wanted to offer it as a webinar so that other MDT members who maybe aren't victim advocates and anybody at an NCCASA member agency could access this information too. As I mentioned earlier, it's a little tricky doing it when we can't be interactive. I like really interactive trainings. If you've ever been to a training I've done in person, I ask a lot of questions, and I enjoy having y'all brainstorm and share your thoughts, because I learn something every time I give a training, because our advocates and staff members at our local programs are so insightful and brilliant, and I love seeing what happens when we put all our ideas together. A webinar makes that a little bit hard. So when I did it last week at the Victim Advocate, it was a meeting, and they could pipe in and have conversation with us. So I do want to encourage you to put any questions or thoughts you have in the chat box, and raise your hand if you want me to unmute you to say something and share with us. A little bit about me. My name is Christy. My pronouns are they, them. I'm the Prevention Education Program Manager at NCCASA, which means that I'm one of the people funded by the CDC to shape and steer and develop North Carolina's statewide sexual violence prevention programming. I want to lead by just sharing my identities. I'm a white, college-educated, assigned female at birth, non-binary or genderqueer person. I also identify as bisexual, pansexual, or queer. I grew up in poverty, have lived experience of homelessness, and lived experience of living under criminalized survival. None of those other marginalized identities negate the fact that I'm a white college-educated person in this culture and country. So while I've done a whole lot of work to try to listen to other people who come from different backgrounds and have different identities so that I can be thoughtful and inclusive when I'm presenting, it's entirely likely and possible that there's pieces that I might be missing. So I want to encourage you to be learning from people other than me too, who have different lived experiences and can bring a variety of perspectives to what you're learning about LGBTQ identities. Here are a few of my favorite people that I've enjoyed learning from who have different identities. We have African American and Black and Afro-Latinx and people who have different binary trans identities in here. Aisha Simmons, Amita Farin, and Ignacia Rivera are doing a lot of really good work. You can learn a lot from following the work of the Trans Latina Coalition. They are doing great work to support trans women, Latinx trans women. And In Our Own Voices is another nonprofit that does a lot of great trainings, has a good conference every 2 years. The In Our Own Voices, they're out of Albany. They are an anti-sexual and domestic violence and anti-violence and sexual wellness organization run by and focusing on the needs of LGBT people of color. So they're bring a very valuable perspective for those of us to learn from who have, are able to attend their trainings. Black Trans Media has good information out there, and I've also really enjoyed following on social media QTPOC Mental Health, which has a lot of work, a lot of information out there, not just about mental health, but about trauma recovery and the experience of violence and how that can intersect with your other identities. So these are the people to really be learning from, and I'm aware of the inadequacies of some of my own identities and experiences and how that shapes what you'll hear from me today. We're going to talk today about current best practices for inclusive language and frameworks. Not all LGBTQ people are the same or have the same preferences, so even though we're going to share what we know to be best practices now, some people that like certain words, other people may not like those words. So it's good to learn these frameworks and language that we're going to talk about today, but it's important to remember to let the survivor or client or family you're working with self-identify and tell you how they understand their experience. We do know also that language is always fluid, evolving, and contested, even within communities. So the language that we use today to describe LGBTQ populations, it's not the same as the language that they used 25 years ago when I first came out. And I'm sure it's not the same as what people will be saying in another 10 years, how they will describe their experiences. So we remember that language changes, and it's not like we sorted out once and for all and now we have the answers. There's always this evolving body of knowledge. You'll hear me sometimes use victim or survivor to refer to somebody, and frequently victim. I use that when I'm referring to a legal framework or a crime, because it's about someone doing something against you that broke a rule or a law. For me, I like using the word survivor when I'm looking at what you've done, how you've moved past harm, or how you've experienced living even within harm, because that's not about whether or not something was right or wrong. It's about, legally, it's about whether or not something landed right or wrong in your body, in your heart, and about the harm that was done. Same with perpetrator versus harm doer. Perpetrator to me is a criminal justice word that describes someone who committed a crime, whereas we can look at harm doer, and that takes it out of seeing whether or not something is illegal as our ultimate arbiter of whether or not it was okay to do. If someone caused harm, they're a harm doer, whether it rises to the level of needing a criminal offense or not. The other caveat is that this is an overview. There are people who get graduate degrees in queer theory, and there's no way we can cover all of that, and there's no way that all of it would be relevant to what you're doing in your work. So we're just going to do an overview today. We are going to have a follow-up webinar in a couple of weeks that is called Working with LGBTQ Survivors. So today is mostly going to focus on language, frameworks, and a few statistics to help you understand why it matters. The next webinar in 2 weeks is going to be on how do you put that into practice, because I think a lot of times we get the erroneous idea that just because we've learned the right words, and maybe we've learned some pronouns and how to use pronouns, that we're doing good, and we forget that there's a lot more that goes into working with LGBTQ survivors, and even in workplaces with other LGBTQ individuals. There's a lot more that goes into it than just knowing the words, although knowing the frameworks and words is important. I'm going to give a content warning. While the majority of this webinar is not super heavy, there are going to be a few slides in the middle there where we go over some heavy statistics and some heavy information that references sexual violence and rape, domestic violence, human trafficking, and other forms of violence against LGBTQ people. And I know that hitting some of those heavy slides, especially right now, we're all a little tender, a little bit dysregulated. Some of you may feel a little dysregulated because of our routines being disrupted and just the stress of living during a pandemic. So any of those things can contribute to how we receive and process heavy statistics and information, especially if you're a tender-hearted person, which I'm assuming most of us are, because that's why we're in this work, because we love deeply and want to be able to help others. But especially if you are yourself LGBTQ, some of those slides may be a little hard. So I want to encourage you. I'm going to let you know when we're getting to those slides, and I want to encourage you to take care of yourself. Take a big deep breath if you feel yourself getting overwhelmed with some of this. If you need to take the earbuds out for a minute and just breathe, that's fine by me. And I want us to assume good intentions and recognize that there are no silly questions. In general, we don't want your one or two LGBTQ coworkers to have to be your educators about everything, or the client that you're working with should not have to be the one to educate you about it. So I know we tend to discourage people from asking intrusive questions of a client they're working with or a coworker, but we're here to learn today. So this is the perfect space to ask what you might otherwise be hesitant to ask. That's what I'm here for today, and we're going to assume good intentions if someone asks a question that maybe someone else might think is a basic question, or maybe a question that feels kind of funny. The fact is, we're all here to learn. So no silly questions, and we're going to assume good intentions and give each other some grace around how we're learning. Does that sound good to everybody? Do these disclaimers and agreements look good? If you want to throw something in the chat box to let me know you are on board with these, that'd feel great. Scrolling through my, yay, all right, thank you. Scrolling through my attendee list right now to make sure that we have on. Okay. So moving on. I want to do a little empathy building reflection for you, and I know sometimes it's easy for us to get caught up in the intellectual piece of these kinds of learning experiences where we're trying to learn what things mean and the right words to use and how that works, but honestly, having really powerful empathy for someone can help you be a much better support to them. So I want to encourage you, if you are LGBTQ, don't feel like you have to play along with this activity because you already know what it's like to grow up under this. But if you're not, if that's not a key part of your identity, I want you to think for a minute about what kinds of messages did you get about gay or lesbian people when you were a child? What did you hear them called? What names, what words? How did you hear them referred to? What kinds of things did people say or expect from them? Were they seen as valuable members of your families and communities, or were they seen as not accepted fully? Maybe they were seen as being somehow wrong. And think about how you got those messages, what messages you got from your families, and what kinds of messages you got in your schools, and in media and culture. And you don't have to reply to this. I just want you to sit with this for a minute. What you see on TV shows and in movies and in songs. How did they talk about that? And then sort of revisit that. What kinds of messages did you get about transgender people? In your families or your culture, in your schools, and from media and culture. Maybe there were some negative messages, some overtly negative messages about lesbian and gay people and transgender people, but there might have also just been invisibility. I didn't even know they existed when I was little. So think about that for just a moment and imagine that you are someone who identifies as LGBTQ and that you grew up hearing those same kinds of messages, and how might that feel for you to have grown up hearing all of these messages about you and about a piece of your identity that feels really normal and natural to you, but that maybe wasn't affirmed and validated by people around you in the way that it could have been. And I want you to hold that with you as we kind of go through some of these intellectual pieces, learning language, learning statistics. Hold that with you, what that might have felt like to grow up hearing these sort of messages constantly about yourself and about who you knew yourself to be. And keep in mind that we're learning what we're learning today, not just to learn some statistics and language, but so that we can hold better space for survivors in our communities and build better programs to meet their needs. So for the purpose of this webinar, we've just done LGBTQ+, but sometimes you'll see some extra letters on there, and I just kind of want to go through what those are so you'll know what they are when you see them. So L is lesbian, and that is a word that we use for a woman who is sexually or romantically attracted to other women. Another word that you'll hear is gay. That's a word that could refer to anyone of any gender who has same-sex attraction. But a lot of times when we see it in the LGBTQ, when we talk about gay, we're thinking of gay men, and that's a man who loves another man. But again, gay can be used to describe anyone of any gender. Bisexual means that it is someone who is sexually and or romantically attracted to someone, people who have the same identity as they do, and people who have a different identity. So same and other attracted. One thing to keep in mind about people who are bisexual is that they are bisexual whether they're dating someone of the same gender as them, whether they're dating someone of a different gender as them. And there's a term that you hear sometimes called bisexual erasure, and that's where we assume that bisexuals don't exist or we minimize their existence. So a bisexual woman who is in a long-term relationship with a man is still bisexual. This is important for those of you working in agencies to keep in mind that the client or maybe even one of your coworkers might still be bisexual even if they appear to you to be in a heterosexual relationship, because your orientation doesn't change just because you're in a relationship with someone of a different gender. So a bisexual woman in a relationship with a man is still bisexual. A bisexual woman in a relationship with another woman is still bisexual. A bisexual man in a relationship, a long-term relationship with a woman, is still bisexual. So don't participate in bi-erasure or bisexual erasure, which is when we assume that someone's orientation based on their current relationship, forgetting that some people can be attracted to people of different genders. Transgender means that your gender identity does not match the gender that you were assigned at birth. Queer, the Q is for queer or questioning. Queer is a tricky word. Remember how we said earlier that language changes over time. So sometimes queer started out as a negative word, a slur used to insult people. And so sometimes older LGBTQ people may not like that word as much because they remember having that word used against them, with a snarl or in meanness or part of their bullying. What we found is that a lot of younger people are actually way more comfortable with that word and might identify as queer and consider that to be their primary identity. There's even, and that's also the word we use in academia when we're talking about it. You'll hear people talk about studying queer theory, or a professor in the English department who teaches queer literature. or in the divinity school, someone offering queer theology. So queer tends to be the academic word that gets used a lot of times. One of the things about queerness and the way people define it is sometimes people use and prefer that word when maybe they don't feel like they entirely fit into some of the stereotypes about the other identities you see right here, and they pick that one just to be clear that theirs is not heterosexual, that it doesn't fit some of these easy categorizations. The Q can also stand for questioning. One of the things that's super important for LGBTQ people to have is a safe space for themselves to discuss with other people who have shared identities and experiences what their lives and needs are like. And it's important to include questioning people in those spaces because for a lot of people, even if you felt all along that maybe you were LGBTQ, there may have been so much cultural messaging, or maybe as a kid you weren't allowed to think of yourself that way. Maybe you had so much negative cultural messaging that you didn't even feel you could ask if you're this. And so even questioning whether or not you're actually heterosexual can be a very scary and very big thing that some people have to do. So questioning people space to have conversations in community is a really important thing. Intersex is what we refer to when somebody's genitalia don't match one of our neat binary categorizations of how we expect genitalia to look on someone of a certain gender identity. So an example, I can reference someone I know who grew up believing that she was a boy and had no idea that she was intersex until she, as an adult, had some medical issues and went in and had some ultrasonography and x-ray work done, at which point they discovered that she had both a penis and ovaries. And so intersex means that there may be different genitalia than we're expecting that don't fit the binary. In the past, you may have heard the word hermaphrodite used to describe that, and that's not a word that we use anymore today. We refer to it, that incidence happening as someone's gender being intersex. In the past, there was a push because we were so stuck on this gender binary being the only way we knew how to understand somebody's body, that intersex people as infants would frequently find themselves subjected to surgeries or, with air quotes, corrections to help their bodies fit what we expected within a binary. And what ended up happening is a lot of those intersex people who were subjected to surgeries when they were younger, as babies, grew up not even knowing that this had been something that was part of their medical history, and then questioning their gender identity and not knowing why they were questioning their gender identity and not understanding who they were because that was such an important piece of their medical and personal history to leave out of their story. And then would later in life realize that they identified either as a different gender or, in between or non-binary. Today there is a strong push when there is a baby born who's intersex to leave the baby as long as there's not any other biological issues that are causing actual medical problems, baby, and let the baby just grow up and they can make their own choices about the medical care as they get older. The A, a lot of times you hear people say the A is for ally. We typically hear that from allies who really want to be included. And we absolutely value allies and accomplices. We value having people that don't have a personal risk at stake in how this plays out, who are still willing to put themselves on the line supporting their LGBTQ peers and friends. But that's not really part of the LGBTQ definition. The A stands for asexual. And asexual, like a lot of these other LGBTQ concepts, kind of exists on a spectrum to where there's not as much of a neat, you're either asexual or you're not. There can be a whole spectrum for people who identify as asexual, and that might include someone who doesn't experience sexual attraction to other people ever. It might include someone who doesn't experience sexual attraction to other people very often. That asexual spectrum could include people who maybe only experience sexual attraction with people that they already have a pretty strong existing emotional or intellectual or close connection. So the A spectrum is people who tend to not often or not intensely experience sexual attraction. Pansexual just means you're attracted to anybody of any gender, that the body is not what's important to you, which a lot of people who identify in other ways might say that as well. The plus is just to acknowledge that there's plenty more letters we can't remember. Sometimes you'll see 2S included, the number 2 and S, and that's for two-spirit. Two-spirit is a word that is used by certain Native people and Native tribes to describe someone whose gender identity is that they embody fully both male and female and other genders. Two-spirit means that it's not either or, that it's both and sometimes you'll see that in your letters. Another letter you'll see, I didn't put on this list, but sometimes instead of LGBTQ, you'll see GSM when you're reading your social work literature. GSM just means gender and sexual minorities. So GSM is another way to kind of avoid having to write 20 million letters and put a plus. You know, LGBTQIAP2S plus people every time you're writing a paper. You can just say GSM, and that means gender and sexual minorities, and that means we're talking about anyone who isn't just cis and heterosexual. If you have any questions on these, definitely hit me in the chat box or raise your hand. I want to visit the gender unicorn. So some of you may have seen this before, and some of you may have seen a different one called the genderbread person. The genderbread person was a really cool model, but this one gets even neater for me. It allows more space for more accurate representations of people's identities. It was developed by the Trans Student Educational Resources. The idea of the gender unicorn is that instead of having a spectrum where it's a line with arrows on either end that go from woman to man, for example, where the more you embody being a woman, the less you can embody being a man, it allows you to kind of rate how you identify on each of those. So you could be, it allows space for someone like a two-spirit identity, where you could be high on woman and high on man and high on other genders without having to pick a side, so to speak, because for some people that binary of picking a side doesn't feel like who they are. So we're going to unpack these one at a time and just sort of work our way through them, and definitely stop me if you have any questions. And so we'll start with gender identity. Give me 1 second to clear my throat. So gender identity means a person's internal, deeply felt sense of being male or female or some form of in-between or both, regardless of the person's sex assigned at birth. Gender identity is who you are. It has nothing to do with who you're attracted to. All it means is, how do you identify? Do you identify as a man? Do you identify as a woman? Do you feel non-binary? And non-binary could mean that you feel like you're neither man nor woman, or non-binary could mean that you feel sort of in the middle. Sometimes, you know, a little bit of both. Non-binary might mean that you're gender fluid, that depending on the day or time or context, you tend to feel different aspects of your gender more strongly one way or the other. Non-binary can also mean, just all it means is you don't fit into the binary, that you don't feel entirely like a woman or entirely like a man. But how that plays out for people who identify as non-binary can be different from person to person. Gender expression means the manner in which a person expresses their gender identity to others. So gender expression could mean, do you enjoy having a more feminine gender expression, where you like to wear dresses and maybe heels and makeup and have your hair styled in certain ways that feel more feminine to you? How do you carry yourself? Do you like having a gender expression that's more masculine, to where you are wearing clothes and presenting yourself in a way that feels more masculine and less feminine to you? Which way do you like presenting? Someone could have a gender expression that's a mix. Someone could have a gender expression that doesn't match their gender identity too. So maybe someone identifies as a woman, but maybe prefers a more masculine presentation. I'm sure we've all, if you might have had friends or people that you've known in your life who were women who had a more masculine style, that maybe liked wearing, you know, men's jeans, baseball hat, boots, whatever. They aren't especially girly in their presentation. But they still identified as a woman because your gender expression doesn't always match your gender identity. Maybe you've known someone who was a man and identified as a man, but sometimes enjoyed or always enjoyed wearing clothes and styles and presenting themselves in ways that our culture thinks of as more feminine. And again, we're being aware that how we understand feminine and masculine is sometimes different within cultures and subcultures. It could be that someone is expressing their gender in a way that is a mix of both. You know, maybe they want to wear really masculine clothes and a whole lot of really glamorous makeup. And their nails are painted, you know, so you can mix it up. You don't have to, that's why on the gender unicorn, we don't have to lean more one way and move away from the other one. We can be both and. So the main takeaway here is that someone's gender expression does not have to match their gender identity. I think this is really important to bring up when we're talking about transgender people, because a lot of times when someone comes out as transgender, there's this expectation that they have to really perform that gender in a certain way. So if you come out as a trans woman and you're living your authenticity as a trans woman, there's an expectation that you have to be super exceptionally feminine all the time. Or if you come out as a trans man, then there's an expectation that you have to be super exceptionally masculine all the time. Or if you come out as non-binary, then there's an expectation that you be appropriately androgynous to look the way we expect you to look. So this is just to remind us that even for trans and non-binary people, your gender expression doesn't have to be exactly lined up with your gender identity. Someone could be non-binary and have long hair and look very, very feminine in their presentation. Someone could be a trans woman who, just like a lot of other women, likes wearing beat-up jeans and a T-shirt and a baseball hat. And they're still she's still a trans woman. So keep in mind that someone's gender expression doesn't have to match their identity and not to make assumptions. Sex assigned at birth is the sex that people are designated at birth based upon their external genitalia. When we talk about someone's sex assigned at birth, that's the language that we use now. I know a lot of times we hear people say, she used to be a man, or it's they feel like a man in a woman's body. And these are words that if someone uses for themselves to describe their experience, let that go, listen, follow their lead. You're going to listen to the way they describe their experience. But we want to avoid assuming that someone who's living as a transgender woman used to identify as a man or was born as a man, because a lot of times someone who's transgender may have their whole life recognized who they were and tried, they might have been scared to tell people around them who they were, even though they knew who they were, or they may have been, they may have tried telling people who they were and been shut down or silenced or punished for that. So, and it could be that someone didn't realize until they got older that they were trans. And they might say, I lived for a while as a woman, or back when I used that language to describe themselves. But we don't want to use that language to describe them because we want to be inclusive and allow them to define their experiences for us. So we'll say your sex assigned at birth. You might say someone was assigned female at birth, or that they were assigned male at birth, or that they were assigned other or intersex at birth. Sexual orientation means the internal experience that determines one's physical or sexual attraction to people. It might be that you are physically and sexually attracted to women or to men or to people of other genders. And again, we don't have that linear binary from attracted to men to attracted to women, to where the more attracted to women you are, the less attracted to men you are. We recognize that you can be attracted to both. And that's one of the great things about the gender unicorn. Romantic or emotional attraction, that orientation means the internal experience that determines one's emotional, romantic, or other attractions to people. What's really interesting here is, I think a lot of times this is a piece of our dialogue around orientation that is not as mainstream. I think a lot of people just assume sexual orientation explains it all. But sometimes people will describe having a romantic or emotional orientation that doesn't entirely align with their physical or sexual orientation. Maybe they're very much sexually attracted to people of all genders, but tend to notice that they fall in love more frequently and enjoy being in relationship with people of the same gender. And so sometimes those don't align up exactly right. Or maybe someone could be asexual and not sexually attracted to anybody, at least not very often, but maybe they do have emotional attractions to people of a different gender from them. So keeping in mind that for some people, they may describe their romantic and sexual orientations to you as being somewhat different from each other. And I know that can be a new one for a lot of people, but you will encounter clients that you work with who describe their experience that way. So just a reminder not to make assumptions. So transgender means that a person's gender identity does not match their sex assigned at birth. Cisgender means that a person's gender identity does match the sex they were assigned at birth. Sometimes we hear of cis people who get a little bit bristly when they hear themselves referred to as cisgender or cis, because they feel like it's somehow suggesting that they're not just a, if you're getting called a cisgender woman, that maybe we mean you're not a woman, you're a certain kind of woman. And there's some resistance to that, but all it means is that your gender identity does match your sex assigned at birth. And the reason that's relevant is because cisgender people don't face some of the forms of discrimination based on their gender identity that transgender people do. So I might say, that cisgender people typically don't feel fear when you're trying to pick a public gendered bathroom to go into, in the way that a transgender person might feel some anxiety about using public restrooms because we know that's a space where they're harassed and sometimes experience violence. It might also be a way of clarifying if we're talking about biology. So an example of that might be if we're talking about, let's see, what's a good example? If we're talking about how cisgender men don't have the experience of menstruation, don't know what that is like, because we recognize if we say men don't know what that's like, then we're including transgender men in that, and that's not a true statement. So sometimes clarifying cisgender can be helpful when we're making a statement to make sure that we're being inclusive of people who have different experiences. So transgender is an adjective. Frequently you'll hear it abbreviated as trans. So trans or transgender can be adjectives. Don't use it as a noun. Don't be that person that says, I was reading that there was a lot of controversy about the transgenders. That's typically a way we hear it used sometimes by people who are either unaware that that can be hurtful, or sometimes it's being used that way to dehumanize them and be negative. So don't use it as a noun. It's an adjective. We have a transgender person or trans woman or trans man. You want to avoid transsexual or cross-dresser. Transsexual you'll still see in medical literature sometimes to refer to someone's relationship to medical transition. But for our purposes and for what we're doing and in general everyday conversation, we don't want to use transsexual because some people hear that word and it automatically hones them in on this concept of sexuality, which then contributes to hypersexualizing trans people who already experience a lot of being hypersexualized or fetishized. Similarly, don't use cross-dresser to refer to someone's identity because that's suggesting that it's just plain dress up or that it's somehow just a fetish. So remember, transgender or trans as an adjective, transgender person, transgender man, transgender woman, these are all how you want to use that language. So putting it together and just showing you how people might relate to these different pieces of our gender unicorn. Someone might identify as a lesbian transgender woman. And what that would mean if someone identifies as a lesbian transgender woman is that she is a transgender woman, maybe was assigned male at birth, is now fully living her authenticity as a transgender woman and is romantically and or sexually attracted to women. Transgender lesbians are still lesbians, so that's something that's important to keep in mind. She's a woman who is attracted to women, and that's how we understand the word lesbian, what we understand lesbian means. Someone might, breaking these down again, say that they feel their identity is that they're a bisexual, heteromantic, cisgender man. So if we wanted to know what those words meant, we would know that because this is a cisgender man, this is someone who was assigned male at birth and their gender correlates, so they're a cisgender man. They're bisexual. He is bisexual, which means that he is sexually attracted to men and identities other than men. But this person also feels heteroromantic, so that might mean that he's only romantically or emotionally attracted to or in emotional relationships with people of a different gender. Someone, if we're really breaking it down and giving you a little bit of a quiz here, someone might identify as a pan-romantic, asexual, non-binary person. And what that means is that they're non-binary, so they don't identify as either a man or a woman. Could be that they identify as a little bit of both or somewhere in the middle or something different altogether. They're asexual, which means that they experience sexual attraction rarely or not as intensely or in some other way different from what we normally think of as a, sexual attraction, the way we see it happen most often. They are pan-romantic, which means that they're romantically and emotionally attracted to people of any gender. So that might be an identity someone has. Did y'all have any questions on the gender unicorn? I'm going to mute my phone, take a sip of my drink, clear my throat, and give y'all a minute to type any questions or raise your hand if you want to go back to any of that before we move on. Okay. So moving on. Part of the reason you'll notice I gave my own identities at the beginning of this is because I want to be careful not to speak over people who have different intersectional identities than I do. The way to understand intersectional oppression is to remember that all of us are all of our whole selves at all times. It's not like if you are an LGBTQ, this is not even getting into oppression, but just some of my other identities. I'm a parent. If I'm an LGBTQ, if I'm a queer parent, then when I go to a parents meetup with other parents to discuss parenting, I'm still queer. If I go to a queer meetup to discuss queer things about LGBTQ people, I'm still a parent. And I can't separate those identities and pieces of who I am from each other. Similarly, if we think about any person existing at the intersections of different forms of oppression, and that could include classism, where we tend to enact harm systemically and structurally against people who are poor or in poverty. Sexism, where we tend to see that masculine and patriarchal power is exerted over women and people who don't fit the gender binary in the way that we want them to. They experience sexism. Ableism is what we refer to it when someone experiences oppression based on having a health diagnosis or health challenge. Homophobia and transphobia is oppression that's experienced by virtue of someone identifying as LGBTQ. And then racism is obviously oppression based on people's race. And all of these are systemic and structural. You don't get to opt out of racism because we're living in this culture that is itself got a lot of very racist underpinnings. So it's important to remember these aren't individual things. All of us grew up hearing these frameworks. We grew up experiencing these systems differently based on our own identities. And so someone who is experiencing homophobia or transphobia and also has other oppressed identities or marginalized identities is going to be experiencing that homophobia and transphobia within the context of also experiencing other forms of oppression. That is important to remember, that when we talk about LGBTQ people, we can't talk about how to serve them and support them without talking about ways that we can help work against these other forms of oppression. That was something that in a recent call that I had with North Carolina's LGBTQ identified staff people at local programs, that was a concern that some of them brought up, was the importance of including racial equity and other work against these oppressions, and how they each need that work to be done as well. So those of you who've done prevention work or have a public health background are going to be familiar with the social ecological model of looking at public health prevention. And in that model, risk factors increase the likelihood of violence occurring, even if not causal. Protective factors decrease the likelihood of violence occurring, or they increase your resilience so that you have better access and more options for healing in the aftermath of violence. It's important to remember when we talk about risk factors that they increase the likelihood of violence occurring. A risk factor can increase the likelihood of someone experiencing violence. Risk factors can also increase the likelihood of someone enacting violence on another person. So when we talk about prevention and how we can respond to people, we need to be attentive to the ways that risk factors don't just increase the likelihood of experiencing, but also increase the likelihood of perpetrating or enacting harm. So these risk and protective factors occur at each level of the social ecological model. There are individual ones, there are relationship level ones, there are community level ones, and there are societal level ones. So I want you to think about some of what you know from your culture, from looking around you, from clients that you've worked with. And I want to see if in the chat box, or maybe if you raise your hand, I can give you a chance to speak. If some of you can share, where does risk enter the lives of LGBTQ people? What are places at the individual, relationship, community, and society level where you see that LGBTQ people are exposed to greater risk for violence? I have a hotline background. I am super comfortable with silence. I can sit for a little bit to give y'all a chance to respond. Where do we see risk entering the lives of LGBTQ people? I saw that someone just dropped out of the webinar. Sorry for the pressure. Really hoping to get a little more interaction out of y'all. So I think we can look at the relationship level, and one of the first things we can flag is an unsupportive family. Having an unsupportive family, lack of family support, can be a big area where risk enters people's lives, because not only does that increase the risk of things like them being kicked out of the house or running away, which then exposes them to all sorts of violence, up to and including sexual abuse and exploitation and trafficking. But the other thing is that's experienced as a trauma. It's very traumatic, and it's experienced as an emotional abuse to be invalidated or berated for who you are by your family. Hey, someone shared something. So witnessed intersectional experience at a previous position, individual with a diagnosis of IDD and who identified as non-binary. Communication difficulties meant the family served as a preventive barrier from communal expression of actualized identity. Yes, so that's a very common thing if I'm understanding what you're describing here. having those communication difficulties around the family. They're not able to understand the family's getting in the way of someone being able to express their identity, and a lot of times, especially if there's intersections with IDD, it's very easy for some of their attempts to express who they are to be written off as them not understanding, or the parents feel like they know better, and that lack of support can increase risk. At the community level, lack of local LGBTQ community can be an area where risk enters their lives because they don't have healthy adult models as young people, you don't have healthy adult models to engage with and learn more about who you are. As an adult, you don't have opportunities for healthy socialization. You feel isolated. That isolation can be really devastating for people. Societally, lack of protections. At the societal level, lack of laws that protect you or enacting of laws that actively discriminate against you can be really problematic, and we see that when it comes to allowing federal funding to be used to fund shelters that don't have appropriate housing for transgender people experiencing homelessness or trafficking or DV. And what ends up happening is, that then, since that shelter is getting funding in a community, that's the shelter for the community. So that person doesn't have safe places to go. Someone here says not experiencing support from teachers, coaches, religious leaders, etc. Yes, especially for young people, having that support from their teachers. I mean, even if they don't have support in their family, if they can get that support from a teacher or a coach or a religious leader, that can really make a huge difference. And sometimes these community leaders, and I think I would include religious leaders into that, but we all know that we're part of different communities, and there's other community leaders who have a powerful impact. A lot of times, community leaders are guiding parents on how to respond to their LGBTQ kids and applying pressure, and I have on a number of occasions had conversations with parents of an LGBTQ child who wanted to support their kids but felt like they were so scared of being judged in their communities and the groups that they're part of and by their friends that they actually enacted harm against their kids and were discriminatory and judgmental because they felt like they couldn't do anything else. So having teachers and coaches and religious leaders and other community leaders encouraging not just the kids but also giving the parents permission to fully accept their kids can make a big difference. So here's where we hit some heavy slides, and for the next few slides we're going to cover some pretty dark statistics, so everybody just kind of know that's coming and take a deep breath so that it won't feel quite as overwhelming, and if you are LGBTQ especially, take care of yourself in the way you need to while we talk about some of these disparities. So 30% of LGBTQ youth report family physical violence after they come out. 40% of homeless youth identify as LGBTQ, and 46% of those ran away due to family rejection. LGBTQ foster youth are 2 times more likely to live in a group placement rather than a family, which then impacts the aging out process. So those of you whose work intersects with foster care knows that 18 to 24 aging out age range is an especially vulnerable one. We forget how much support most people usually need and want during that time period, somewhere to go do laundry, someone to call when you're not sure how to fill out a lease. These are things that LGBTQ foster youth are less likely to have access to because of being in group placements. Trans foster youth have 2 times more placements on average than LGBT youth. LGBTQ youth are 2 times more likely to report poor treatment by the foster care system. And this is a real heavy one. This one feels really heavy in my throat when I say it, but they're 7.4 times more likely to experience sexual violence than their cis and hetero peers. And that comes from a 2015 study of LGBT high school students in which 18% of high school students who identify as LGBT said they have been physically forced to have sexual intercourse versus 5% of their peers. And 18% report physical dating violence compared to 8% of their peers. LGBTQ youth are 3 to 7 times more likely to engage in survival sex, and again, we're looking back to some of those homelessness, runaway, kicked out statistics. And when they do engage in survival sex, they're 2 to 10 times more likely to be held for prostitution charges, even though we know there's no such thing as a child prostitute, that any minor engaged in a sex trade is a victim of sex trafficking by the definitions that we use, the legal definitions. They still get held for prostitution charges, and that tends to break down by gender. We tend to find that LGBTQ girls are twice as likely than than heterosexual and cisgender minor girls to be held for prostitution charges when they're picked up. LGBTQ boys are 10 times more likely to be held for prostitution charges when they get picked up, and that's because of this cultural bias and pathologization of gay male sexuality. So they're born and raised into a discriminatory and hostile society, and so because of that, LGBTQ people in the U.S. context are 4 times more likely to commit suicide. They're more likely to feel unsafe at school and to skip class or drop out due to not feeling safe. LGBTQ youth who experience family rejection are about 8 times more likely to experience suicide or to attempt suicide. So 8 times more likely without family rejection, 4 times more likely in general. But the interesting thing is there's a study a few years ago that showed that transgender youth with family acceptance of their gender have rates of depression similar to that of their cisgender peers, and their rates of anxiety are only slightly higher. So I have seen the statistic about the percentage of transgender people who have attempted suicide actually weaponized against transgender people in ways that I found particularly gross and harmful, where you hear people saying things like, these statistics show how mentally ill they are. But honestly, if you have transgender youth who have family acceptance, the studies show that they have rates of depression similar to that of their peers. So what's leading to that self-harm, that greater likelihood towards committing or attempting suicide, what's leading to that is this lack of acceptance and lack of family acceptance and lack of community acceptance. When we have that acceptance in place, we mitigate some of those impacts. And so this slide is probably one of the hardest ones for me, but it's just kind of showing the different ways in which LGBTQ people experience violence. They have violence from within, which is where in their own families and homes they're experiencing intimate partner violence, child abuse, domestic violence. We have systemic violence, which is where we have lack of protection in our workplace, housing, and schools. We have heterosexism and cissexism, which is where just the cultural climate being biased against them, or biased either against them in terms of harm or biased against them in terms of invisibility. We have legal discrimination that they experience. And then they also have their just interpersonal stuff, harassment and bullying and experiencing hate crimes. LGBTQ people do experience hate crimes where they're assaulted just for being LGBTQ. We have experiences of transgender women in particular having higher rates of being killed. There's an epidemic of violence against trans women, and a lot of that times that's because someone is attracted to them and then finds out that they are transgender and gets angry and full of rage as if you've tricked me, because they are viewing this person as being a trickster instead of just living their authenticity. And then there's also corrective rape, which is a really heavy thing that I almost don't want to bring up, but the fact is I don't want the first time you hear about corrective rape to be when you're working with someone who's experienced it and they share it with you and you seem shocked or uncomfortable or have a reaction that maybe leads them to not feel a sense of safety. So corrective rape is something that people experience either at the hands of family members or community members, maybe even schoolmates, where they are raped by someone who says they're doing it to fix them. I'm going to make you not gay anymore. I'm going to make you a woman or whatever. So that is something that LGBTQ people do experience and is especially harmful and traumatic and confusing to try to recover from. Oh, okay, so we're through with the heavy parts of the slides. If you want to take a big breath, we made it through all those statistics. And I want to think a little bit about safety. And we're going to be thinking about safety in terms of how do we find safety in our communities and in our neighborhoods. Community might mean school, it might mean church, it might mean your regional area. How do we find safety in relationship? And when we talk about experiencing safety in relationship, we're thinking obviously of intimate partner relationships, but also relationships with parents and family members and siblings, in relationship with teachers and coaches and community leaders. And we're thinking of, in that category, relationship with survivors, with service providers. So how does that survivor experience safety in their relationship with you? What are you doing to foster safety in a way that they can relate to and that's meaningful for them? And then we're also thinking about just safety in the body, the neuroscience of being able to relax. Those of you who work with trauma survivors know that, or who are trauma survivors, we know that those experiences of trauma get embedded in our nervous systems in ways that we sometimes have physical responses that aren't even under our conscious control at first when we are in a situation that feels risky or confusing. So be thinking about how might this feel different for LGBTQ survivors, and how might LGBTQ inclusive programming still feel potentially unsafe. These are things we're going to unpack in our next webinar when we get a little more into working with LGBTQ survivors. But for now, be thinking about how you understand safety might be different. An example of that is safety in the body. Transgender people, especially if you're growing up being told that your body is wrong or flawed or not right, or that your understanding of it is wrong, then you might have a harder time finding safety in your body and being able to relax fully in your body. If you are, we talked about those super high rates of criminalization of boys involved in survival sex because we criminalize gay male sexuality. If you've lived under that, having your relationships pathologized and been made to feel like they're in some way dangerous, then you might have a harder time finding safety in relationships. And this can differ from one survivor to the next, from one person to the next, but be thinking of the ways some of these may come up in your provision of services. There's also theory versus practice and policy versus reality. I think a lot of our agencies have anti-discrimination policies in place. We have really good ideas about theories about how we don't want to be discriminatory towards anyone, and yet the reality is sometimes different from that. If you have a policy against discrimination, but you're implementing it in ways that are inconsistent or biased, then your policy is not really helping. These are all things we'll unpack more in the next webinar. The main thing for today is just knowing that sometimes there's a disconnect, that having a policy in place is good and is also not enough. Having LGBTQ inclusive programming is great and is also not enough. You have to be willing to continually engage in living the ideals that you're promoting and striving towards. Some general barriers to care that LGBTQ people may experience will include dealing with stigma, having negative experiences or the perception thereof, and that perception part is important because obviously if someone themselves has had negative experience with your agency or your system or people in your position in the past, then they're going to come in a little anxious about interacting with you. If you're a therapist, for example, and you have someone who had an experience with a therapist before where maybe they were forced to go to therapy that they didn't want to go to, but the therapist who didn't understand or validate their identity, they might be a little bit nervous coming in to see you, even though you're wonderful. The perception is important because if they believe or have heard of other people with similar identities to them having a negative experience with your agency or you or people in your position or the system you're engaged with, whether it's foster care, law enforcement, medical systems, if they've heard of people with their identities having negative experiences, that can be a barrier to them coming in for care. Hetero and cissexist agency policies and procedures. can be a barrier to care. So if you aren't being intentionally inclusive, and that could include something as simple as, you know, not giving a space for someone to identify the name they want to be called with, only allowing their legal name, which is a cis-sexist policy. I'm going to remember how to speak eventually. So leaving a space if you need a legal name for processing insurance, or because you're engaged with law enforcement or whatever, making sure that you have a space for them to identify and that you make an intention of using their name that they go by, so that you aren't misgendering and deadnaming them on a regular basis. So that's one example. Another barrier could be a system that prioritizes differently gendered relationships and cisgender experiences as normal or natural. So if you're considering anything other than cisgender heterosexual orientation to be abnormal, but you're open-minded about it, that's still not accepted and validating and can be a barrier to care. Another barrier could be lack of LGBTQ specific programs or services. I know when we think about services, support groups, for example, sometimes LGBTQ people of any gender indicate that they feel more comfortable in a mixed gender LGBTQ only support group space than they do in a support group for people who have the same gender identity as them. So for example, a bisexual woman might be more comfortable in an LGBTQ mixed gender group than in a women's survivors group. Maybe she's more comfortable in the women's survivors group, but again, having those options so that they can self-disclose and choose what they know works better with how they understand themselves can be good. Systemic failure can be a barrier to care. Sometimes we're stuck working in systems that don't always work for the people that we are trying to work for. So the systems can fail us with this survivor that we're working with. Systems may have also failed this survivor in the past, and they're afraid to come back in and get engaged again, which can lead to them having a distrust of systems and even a distrust of research, especially when researchers have, and this is the case, I love social workers, and also there are some social work researchers who come into their research in ways that have sort of a savior mentality, or you feel like they're studying you like they're studying some zoo animal instead of treating you like a human. So there can be a distrust of research too. And also another barrier could be shame around experiences, identities, and behaviors that don't match the cultural norms in your community. That's why at the beginning we started with a little bit of empathy building and had you think about messages and what people grow up hearing about lesbian, gay, and transgender and bisexual people. What are the things that you heard from the time you were a child? And then if you imagine that you grew up hearing these messages about you and about your identity and about your love for people that you were attracted to, if you grew up hearing all of that, it's really hard not to internalize some of it. So someone may be very afraid of disclosing that to you. And I tell you this, not because you need to treat it like it's a shameful thing and get, your own concerns worked into, layered on top of their anxieties, but be aware that when you get to the point when you're doing intake with someone where you might have a question around gender or what name they use or what pronouns they use, be aware that if that person has a bit of hesitation or maybe is not, talks a little softer, or maybe they speak a little slower because they're looking like this is something that's hard for them to talk about, sometimes that can be rooted in fear of how you're going to react, and sometimes it might be rooted in just having some of their own shame that they have to work through. And are you going to be yet another person who shames me or judges me for who I am? So remembering to offer some gentleness and grace when you're talking to people who seem to be struggling to talk with some of this. Give them plenty of space to speak at their own pace and using their own words and reflecting and mirroring that language back to them. So this is the point where I want to open it up for questions, and you can either raise your hand and I can unmute you, or you can type a question in the chat box. Does anybody have any questions? And while you're typing or thinking through questions, I want to again revisit some of these people. If you didn't get all their names written down, or the agencies or groups that they're doing written down earlier, jot these down. These are some good people to follow on social media to see their websites, what trainings they offer, learn a little more. And we do have another webinar in a couple of weeks where we're going to take what we talked about today. We're going to assume that anyone on that webinar has already done a good LGBTQ 101, that you've got this basic knowledge. And we're going to start moving more into how to work with LGBTQ survivors. What are some things that you or your agency can do to be more inclusive and welcoming? And it looks like nobody's typing any questions in. So I want to tell you that if you have questions that maybe you didn't want to ask on the webinar today, or that come up for you afterward, you can always email me. I love getting email from people. Give me an email and ask any questions that you have. For those of you who are curious about certificates of attendance, those will be sent out. Our training coordinator said probably in the first week of June, you'll get a certificate sent out to you. If you have any questions at all, drop me an email. Don't call that number. We're all working remotely right now. You'll get my voicemail. But send me an email, and I'll be happy to set up a time to chat with you or try to answer your questions or give you any resources you need. And thank you so much for being here with us today. Bye, y'all.